Okay, so we're going to be continuing on our kind of analysis and review of the various Wolfnet radio podcast missions that are used in Alpha Strike 350. And we're moving on to mission number 2, which is capture the flag. Before we get started, we're just going to go over a quick disclaimer. The purpose of these videos is really to talk about list, terrain, and tactical considerations. At the beginning, I do an overview of the mission. It's basically a summary. To make sure that you really understand the mission, go to the Wolfnet Radio podcast website in the description below and download the rules and read them for yourself. All right, so rules review. So in this mission, you're going to need several components. It's going to be 3 flags tokens. Wolfnet recommends use a purple, orange, and green. They use dice to mark those flags, although I've built my own small kind of tokens that I use on. They're basically like supply caches that I put on pennies, and I use those as well. The reason that they're purple, orange, and green is because they correspond with the colors of the center objectives, so that they, when they're cached and they're scored, they go back to the right objective. You need 1 blue and 1 red objective area template, a 3-incher, and these are going to be your bases, and then a purple, orange, and green objective template that are going to be your supply caches or your capture the flag points in the middle of the board. The objective of this mission is to retrieve and deposit 4 flags from the 3 area tokens, objective area tokens, in the middle of the map. So you're running up to the middle, you're securing that objective. When you secure the objective, you pick up the flag, and then you're running it back to your base. And if you successfully do that, then you score. You're going to place those flag tokens on the objective tokens or objective templates in the middle. So in order to pick up the flag, any type of unit has to have a portion of their base on the objective template in the middle of the board, and they must be grounded. So hovercraft have to be landed on the ground, but they can pick them up. Dismounted, so infantry that are in transports can't carry them. And it has to be uncontested, meaning that there are no opponents on the objective. And this is not by weight. This is that there are no opponents on there. So for a tactical consideration we'll get into later is being able to deny your opponent's ability to pick up those objectives by towing into those. During the in phase, a unit that has met these conditions is considered to be carrying the flag. Units that have picked up the flag are to place the token in base-to-base contact with the unit, so it's obvious who's carrying it. If the unit drops the flag due to elimination, the flag must stay where it is and cannot be moved until another unit picks that flag up. So if you get killed while holding the flag gets dropped there, it does not return to the center base, and then another unit can come along, move into base-to-base contact, and pick up the flag. That unit also has to be grounded, dismounted, and has to be uncontested in base contact. So if you are in base contact with the flag and someone else is in base contact with the flag at that point, then nobody can pick it up. Units can only carry 1 flag at a time, so you can't run from objective area template to objective area template and pick up multiple flags, or you can't, if you're carrying a flag, you can't pick one up that's been dropped. You may pass a flag off to a friendly unit. In order to do that, both of the units have to be in base-to-base contact, again, grounded, dismounted, and they'll pass the flag off during the in phase. So you can't daisy chain. You can't be like, I move and run to a guy, hand it off, move and run to another guy, hand it off, move and run to another guy, and score all in the same turn. It's only transferred at the end of the in phase. So if you're destroyed and it's dropped, then it doesn't happen. Units transporting battle armor or conventional infantry carrying a flag may also carry another flag. So what this means is that you have an infantry stand, it picks up a flag, and it moves into, say, a maximum hover transport that is also carrying a flag. You are allowed to do that. Scoring whenever a flag token is inside of a team base. So that's going to be your red and blue objective templates that are on your back line. The team scores a point regardless of the unit carrying the flag token survives. So if you are carrying a flag and the flag is dropped in your base, then you score. Units must be grounded, dismounted in order to deposit flags. So infantry that's inside transports have to get out. Hover or Vtols that are flying have to land. Once the flag is deposited, the flag respawns on its corresponding OAT or objective area template token. It respawns during the in phase back into the center of the board. For each flag that you deposit, you score 1 point. The winning conditions is first player to score 4 points wins the game. The player with the most objective points wins the game. Tiebreakers move to MOV or total amount of units destroyed. So that is the overview of the rules. Like I said, make sure you go to the Wolfnet PDF and read it for yourself to make sure you got everything right. Some considerations when it comes to the rules and the objective markers. We did this in bunkers, talked about how important it was to orient those bunkers appropriately so that proper line of sight is drawn. Wolfnet uses dice for the flags, but they easily can be modeled again as supply caches, high value targets, or other flags, which is totally acceptable, especially if you're doing pickup games. And it can also be fun to model your base. I've done that before where I have a little sandbag bunker set up or something that just shows where my base is. The big thing that I think is a big consideration here is make sure that the bases are placed where they are supposed to be. This is especially true if you're playing on a 4x3 mat. So that would be a 48x36 mat. The missions for Wolfnet are actually played on a 42x36 mat. And those, as you can see on the map, the bases have to be on the back line. Well, if you're playing on a 48-inch map, it actually needs to be 3 inches forward because the first 3 inches aren't used. And that it can be really easy to accidentally move the base out of position or place it too far back or too far forward because you're not measuring appropriately. So make sure you're doing that. And it is on your back center line. It's not on the back of your deployment line. So it should be in your deployment zone. And so if you look at the map that's on the screen, you'll see that. List considerations. So capture the flag is one of those missions, just like bunkers, that will make or break your 350 list. It challenges you and forces you to invest your points wisely because you need to be very heavy in speed. If you don't do this, if you don't invest in some speed to play this mission and this mission comes up in the tournament, and I know you can't always count on that because sometimes it's only a 3-game tournament or a 5-game tournament and you may not play capture the flag. But if you don't have those points there invested into your speed and capture the flag comes up, you will have an almost impossible time beating this mission. And you don't have to, if you're wanting to run something heavier and slower, you don't have to invest a lot of very expensive points into playing capture the flag. There are some very cheap units especially cheap, fast units that you can skill down to sneak some points in, but you do need to have points dedicated to playing this mission. And capture the flag has some overlap because a lot of those units can also be very good in other missions that require you to have speed to grab objectives, right? Unlike bunkers, where it's like a lot of times that infantry is only in your list to play bunkers, right? So, but you do need to have speed. It is very, very, very important. I'm going to go over some of the different unit types that I like to run in these lists. It's certainly very difficult to run all these unit types, although it is possible. In your 250 list, just because of the points considerations when you're trying to build a balance list, but you need to address these things in some way, shape, or form. The speed component being most important. I'm going to give some examples of units. They're not necessarily the units you have to run. What we really want to focus on is the characteristics of those units. So the first thing to consider is that your center line is 21 inches up, right? And so if you take into consideration your 2-inch deployment zone, that takes you down to 19 inches. You need to have something that goes at least 20 in your list that can get on those objectives turn 1. So what you're looking at is stuff that is Team M4 or 5. If you take stuff that's Team M4 or 5, you'll be able to reliably get on those objectives turn 1. And more importantly, on turn 2, if you grab a flag, you'll be able to score. Or you'll be close to scoring, right? And so taking stuff that's Team M4 or 5 can be really key to being successful in this list. So the type of units you're going to really want to consider for this role are either really light runners or heavier runners that are a little slower but bring some body. The light runners, you're going to look at your Swiftwind scout cars, your skimmers, your Savannah Masters, your Gabriels, your hover transports. These things don't have a lot of health, so you do have to be really careful with them because if your opponent is wise and tries to take them out and focus fires on them by volume or by skill, they'll die very quickly. So you don't want to just throw them away because you'll find yourself out of runners very quickly. And the other is like heavier fast hovers. These are going to be like your TMM4 and 5 harassers, your J. Edgars that are TMM4, things like that. These things have a little more body. Oftentimes they're a little bit slower, but they have a little more body so that they can survive. But they cost more, right? So like the J. Edgar with the MG package is like 24 points base, right? Whereas like you can run 2 skimmers skilled down for like 5 points each. So that's a big difference. So I usually try to do a combination of the two. I like to have like at least one, if not two, of those lighter runners, and then at least one, if not two, of those heavier fast runners. And then the other thing to consider is fast mechs, the TMM4 and 5 mechs. These are going to be like your Hermes, your Fire Moths, your Mercuries, your Darts, your Fireballs, some of the later era Locusts that really get up the speed. These things have the ability to move very quickly. Oftentimes they have a little bit more body. They're bringing some other things to the table as well. So those things can be very effective. I really personally, as a Word of Blade Comstar player, I like the Hermes and the Mercury. They are almost always in every one of my Comstar and Word of Blake lists, right? So those three groups of unit types, Vtols as well. I'll throw Vtols in there if you have fast Vtols. The problem with them is they have to land on the target, and that can expose them. If you fly them too high, you have to take moving through your altitude into consideration. Vtols have get that +2 to their motive hits, so that's something to consider over your hovers, which are a +1. Your mechs don't have any motive hits, so those Vtols, they're a little more vulnerable, right? Because they're trying to get to that center objective to grab the objective while everything else is closing. So you're not able to use them like you might normally use them in a game, which is to keep the distance between you and your opponent, especially in that first turn where everyone's trying to get on the objective. Suddenly you got a VTOL that's landed, that's at close range with an opponent. It can be a little rough, but you can use VTOLs as well to grab flags. So these are all my runners. Those heavier hovercraft and even some of the mechs I would consider hunters. So your runners are grabbing flags, your hunters are trying to stop the opponent's runners. These things all have speed and sometimes can have the firepower to take them out. You then have heavy hovercraft. These are primarily going to be something like even like a Pegasus, and by heavier, I'm talking about they have a little more body, not necessarily in size. They have more health. When I say body, I mean health. And they have more guns, right? They have more firepower, but usually they're in that 16 to 18 movement range. So if they do a standard move, they're not going to be able to get onto the objective turn 1 or back to your base on turn 2. They're very good at covering the objectives because they can close with them, maybe not get on them, but cover them and shoot your opponent off of them if they do get on them in any given turn. They're also very good at hunting, so chasing down your opponent's runners. They also make pretty good wave 2 or wave 3 runners, so they're able to move up. They have the body to withstand some shots. They have some TMM that helps them withstand some shots. Turn 2 or turn 3, they can grab a flag. It just takes them longer to get back. They're also very good at going and chasing down flags that get dropped because they're out kind of doing other things. They're playing in that mid board. The other thing they're really good at is getting across the board with some body and contesting your opponent's base, because if you're on your opponent's base, then they can't score because the base is contested. I like snipers and indirect fire as well in my list. I almost always take a sniper or indirect fire in all my lists, and then they make their way into this list. Sometimes I run two snipers or a sniper and an indirect fire in my 350 list, and I use them depending on how my points spill out, because oftentimes the indirect fire costs a little more than the snipers. But if they are available, I will put them both in this list for capture the flag, because they're oftentimes your opponent isn't focusing their fire on units like this. They're trying to take out your runners, so they're a little more resilient because they're not drawing the fire. And then you skill them down because you're trying to take out hovercraft, and the hovercraft have to move in on you. If you do your terrain right, which we'll talk about terrain considerations in a little bit, you should have open lanes of fire to hit those center objectives where the flags are at so that you can shoot them and clear them off. I like to have stuff that is sniping at 3s, 4s, and 5s, or indirect fire 3s, 4s, and 5s, because you're having a volume of dice and you need to make up for the fact that your opponent's got TMM 4 or 5. And if you have that volume of dice, you oftentimes can blow them up. And even when they're running away and they're on the other side of the board, you have the reach to shoot them and to make contact with them and blow them up as well. So I like having snipers and indirect fire in this list. Oftentimes you're also running a lot of fast units that don't really want to be shooting, and they have the ability to spot, and it's not really hurting you. I like linemen mechs or skirmishers. If you've watched any of my videos, you know this. They're my favorite mechs. I think they're very, very important to have good skirmishers or linemen mechs. And the way I use these is they move up into kind of the mid board. They cover the center objectives. They cover your withdrawal, right? They kind of stand in the way. They block. They provide covering fire. They shoot things. You don't want to lean too heavily on these, though. Usually I only take 1 or 2 in my 250 list for capture the flag. If you're running 3, 4, 5, you're putting too many points into that, right? You'd be better served with more fast stuff and more snipers and indirect fire. But having some linemen that can move up, potentially pick up a flag that gets dropped, and then they have more body, so they're less vulnerable to being killed again. But have good firepower. And what I mean by good firepower is 3s, 4s, and 5s at medium range, because you want that volume and weight of fire to connect with their skimmers and their hovercraft, which have that high TMM. And I would lean like 3's great, 4's better, 5's best. So if you have, a bunch of these skirmisher lineman mechs, say I'm choosing between a champion and a Hercules, like I'm going to try to take that Hercules, right? I'll also make a consideration here that trying to sneak flak into this list can be really important, especially if you run into opponents that are trying to do Vtols. And then along with that is Vtols. Vtols can grab flags. They can also chase down opponents very effectively, and they can get on your opponent's base just because and contest it just because they have the speed. If your list doesn't have the speed element, you can forego the skirmishers or you can forego the snipers, right? That's fine. Like you can work with that. But if you don't have speed in this list, that's it. It's game over. And if you can't be the one that gets on the flags turn 1 or 2 and hold them and dictate the scoring, like it's going to be super rough. And I like to have at least 3 to 5 units that can grab the flag at a minimum, like reliably grab the flag. And what I mean by that is they need to be moving at least 16, preferably 20 or more, right? So if I have a Pegasus and a Drillson in my list, but then I have 2 skimmers and a J. Edgar or 2 J. Edgars and a skimmer, like that's an ideal like package of runners. And if you're running that, you're into it for what? 70, 90, 100, 105 points. That's not terrible, right? Like you don't have to like go all out and just buy like 5 J. Edgar style mechs, right? That are like 25 points a piece, and now you're up to 150 points. You can do this if you play your cards right and invest right with really light stuff that's cheap and some middling stuff. You can invest in such a way where you can get away with like 100 to 110 points of investment, and then put the rest in your snipers, your skirmishers, your indirect fire that are going to provide covering fire, and take out your opponent's runners. So terrain wise, you have to block line of sight to your base. You need to grab a hill and provide a little fort so that when your runners get back to your base, your opponent can't draw a line of sight to them and kill them before they can deposit the flag, right? So you need something, and with that, you need to give some sort of cover for your runners to get to the center board and back from the center board, right? So you're placing hills around the outside board edge or leading up to the flag and leading back to the flag in such a way that your opponent can't draw a line of sight to them and shoot them. And this is why, generally speaking, your hovercraft are going to make better runners than your mechs, because your mechs are taller and the hills aren't going to block the line of sight quite as well. The other thing that building that hill fort in front of your base does is it gives your snipers something to sit on, and it also allows them to protect your base. So if you have a turreted Shrek or Partisan or a Partisan LRM carrier and they're sitting up on that hill and your opponent gets into your base to try to stop you from depositing a flag, you can guard and defend that base while simultaneously using elevation to snipe and draw line of sight to your opponent's runners. So having that like hill in front of your base is really, really, really important. We talked about giving yourself cover for running flags, building that high point. And then the other component for consideration is denying that to your opponent. So it can be difficult to do in case your opponent is wise to this. But if you can build terrain in a way that gives yourselves lanes of fire to the center objectives and to their base, you can ensure that your opponent can't hide. Then that's going to give you the ability to stop their runners from either getting to the center or when they're on the center or getting back. When it comes to the center objectives, what you really need to be considering and thinking about is blocking line of sight from your opponent's base or table edge to those center objectives. So placing a hill like within 2 inches of the OATs, the objective markers, the 3-inch objective markers, within 2 inches of them on your opponent's half of the board, so that they can't see that. So if you put a fast unit, a small fast skimmer or J. Edgar on the button, on the objective, and even on the back edge towing in, your opponent can't draw a line of sight and see them and shoot them off. That's really key. You're blocking line of sight. You're making sure you can actually pick up the flag. And then if you have enough terrain to cover you on the way back, or you're fast enough, then you're going to be able to more efficiently score. So that can be really important. And then not letting your opponent do that. And sometimes that's a matter of like, maybe you have a hill that's protecting your base and it's a big hill. So you orient it in such a way that your opponent can't then place another piece of terrain, to do the same thing to you, to block those center objectives from their perspective, from their side of the board. Tactics. It's very, 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 very important to focus on the flags and getting there first and grabbing them. If you can secure 2 flags right off the bat within turn 1 or 2 and get them back and score, your opponent is in a hole they have to dig themselves out of. It's not impossible to dig themselves out of, but it's very, very difficult. I've personally only had one game where I was down, I think it was down 3-1, and I came back and won it. It was very difficult to pull off. There was a lot of fancy, funny maneuvering to get into their base, to contest, to get them to drop objectives by killing them, and then by picking them up and running them back. And it was very hard to pull off. Then I probably had no business winning that game. But if you can go up 2 points, 3 points, you basically have it in the bag. The other thing when it comes to shooting considerations is you have to focus on their runners first. Ignore everything else, right? They have runners and they have some sort of big skirmisher, scary mech, or sniper, and it's very tempting to be like, oh, this thing is shooting my runners and it's shooting my stuff, and I want to take it out. Use your movement, use your discipline, use your speed to prevent yourself from being killed, and use your guns to take out their stuff that can actually grab the flag and get back to the base. If you can take out their 2 or 3 runners, and then all they have is like speed 12, speed 10 stuff, like they're going to have a hard time like scoring, right? And you're going to be able to like focus fire on them one at a time and drop them. But if you don't focus on the runners, you're just letting them score basically. So you have to focus on capturing the flags and taking out your opponent's runners and focusing your fire on them. And you have to have volume of fire, right? Like that's why you have to focus so hard on them, because if your opponent's smart and they're running 3, 4, 5, 6 runners, that's a lot of TMM4, a lot of TMM5, a good amount of TMM3. Like you have to have a lot of shots to overcome that, to actually get shots to go through. Challenge your opponent's base. So what I mean by that is if you're in the lead, or even if you're behind, don't be afraid to send something after your opponent's base, to get on their base, to contest it, or to attack their runners that are trying to get there. I oftentimes see people don't play any of their stuff on the other opponent's half of the board, and it oftentimes gets overlooked. And you really want to focus on that and make sure that you're challenging their base, especially if it's like a close game or if you're behind. There are also considerations to be made where you hold on to the flag and you do not score. Because remember, once you score, they go back to the middle. So if your opponent is dominating the middle or is pushing you hard, and you don't think you can get back to the middle without just sacrificing and giving them a point, the wise move might not be to score, but to sit behind that hill fort that you've made and duke it out with your opponent to knock their numbers down and take out their runners before you go and score. So what I mean by this is, let's say you've got 2 flags in your base, your opponent has 1 flag and they've scored, right? And there's 1 more flag in the middle, and they're ready to pick that up and run back and go up by 2 points, right? But they're sitting along that middle line. And if you score your 2 flags, you're just going to put those 2 flags back in the middle. They're going to pick them up the next turn and run and score and win. You may be better off not doing that. Maybe you have an indirect fire unit that's close to your base, and you transfer that flag over and then move your stuff out and then go fight and engage and take the objectives over in the middle, so that you secure them before the flag gets respawned back in the middle. Me and Jairus, my buddy Jairus, during the doubles match at Gen Con, had this happen to us. We ended up grabbing all 3 flags, and our opponent was just wrecking our face. Like they were just outplaying us at every turn. We were just getting annihilated. And what we did was we held those flags back and didn't deposit them, because if we would have deposited them, they would have just won the game. We held those flags back until an opportunity presented itself for us to go score additional points on the secondary mission, which is hold the line for the doubles match, we scored those points, scored the flags, and won the game, right? But if we would have deposited the flags, we would have just been throwing the game away. So don't be afraid to hold on to the flags for a turn, even two, if your opponent controls those center objectives and they're going to steal it. If you don't have the speed, you have to use terrain to leave lanes of fire open, and you have to bully and pick on your opponent's runners. Do not get distracted by this. I can't emphasize this much. You have to bully it and pick on their runners, and make sure you leave lanes of fire open. And if the terrain has been placed in such a way that lanes of fire are not open, then you need to move in such a way that exposes lanes of fire with, say, your skirmisher mechs or even some of your hunters, so that you can draw line of sight to where their opponents want to be running. And this may require you to think a turn or two ahead. Say they have a skimmer and you know that they want to run around this outside edge. Instead of moving towards the center to contest them with your Pegasus, maybe you run your Pegasus around the flank and you make it difficult for them to go that way because you already have a hunter waiting for them, ready to ambush them. These are the things that I think of and I consider when playing Capture the Flag. I consider myself a very good Capture the Flag player. I'm generally very successful at it, unlike King of the Hill, which I struggle with. If I've missed something and there's any other considerations you think are important to note or that people should, keep in mind when playing Capture the Flag, leave it in the comments below. Otherwise, may the blessings of Blake be upon you.